The sun beat down mercilessly on the pristine, manicured lawns of Oakwood Estates as the sleek black SUV of the Homeowners Association president, Vivian Harrington, pulled into the driveway of the modest two-story home belonging to the Wilsons. Vivian's steel-gray eyes narrowed as she stepped out, her designer heels clicking against the pristine concrete. This was a confrontation she had been anticipating for weeks. Marching up to the front door, Vivian rapped sharply, her knuckles betraying the fury simmering just beneath the surface. The door swung open to reveal a harried-looking Sarah Wilson, her brow creased with worry. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, unable to conceal the tremor in her voice. "What can I do for you?" Vivian's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Sarah, I'm afraid I have some unpleasant news. It's about that unsightly kiddie pool in your backyard." Sarah's eyes widened in alarm. "But the kids love that pool. It's the only way they can stay cool during this heatwave." Vivian's expression hardened. "Be that as it may, it's in direct violation of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association bylaws. You have 48 hours to remove it, or will be forced to take further action." Sarah's heart sank. "But Vivian, please, the kids." 48 hours, Sarah," Vivian interrupted, her voice brooking no argument. "I suggest you comply, for all of our sakes." With that, she spun on her heel and strode back to her car, leaving a stunned and terrified Sarah in her wake. As the SUV disappeared down the street, Sarah felt a sense of dread wash over her. The Oakwood Estates HOA was notorious for its iron-fisted rule, and Vivian Harrington was the queen of the castle. Defying her was simply not an option, no matter how much it hurt her children. Slowly, Sarah made her way to the backyard, where her two young sons, Ethan and Liam, were splashing happily in the cool water of the kiddie pool. She watched them, her heart heavy, knowing that soon she would have to break the news. "Mommy, can we stay in the pool a little longer?" Ethan pleaded, his eyes full of innocent joy. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "I'm sorry, sweetie, but we have to take the pool down. The HOA says it's not allowed." Liam's face fell, his lower lip trembling. "But it's so hot. Where will we play?" Sarah pulled her sons into a tight hug, her own eyes brimming with tears. I know. But we have to follow the rules, even if they're not fair. I'm so sorry, my loves." As the Wilsons reluctantly dismantled the pool, the scorching sun continued to beat down, a harsh reminder of the challenge they would soon face. With the kiddie pool gone, how would they keep their children cool in the stifling heat? The story was far from over. The Oakwood Estates HOA had tightened its grip, and the Wilsons were in for a fight. Little did Vivian Harrington know, however, that Sarah Wilson was a force to be reckoned with, one who would stop at nothing to protect her family. The next morning, Sarah Wilson woke with a sense of dread, her mind racing as she contemplated the day ahead. The kiddie pool in her backyard had been her children's only respite from the suffocating heatwave, and now it was gone, thanks to the iron-fisted rule of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. As she prepared breakfast for Ethan and Liam, Sarah couldn't help but notice their solemn expressions, the joy in their eyes replaced by a lingering sadness. She hated seeing her sons so dejected, and she knew she had to find a solution, even if it meant defying the all-powerful HOA. Determined, Sarah finished her meal preparations and gathered her family around the kitchen table. "All right, boys, I know you're upset about the pool, but I have an idea. How would you like to have a party in our backyard today?" Ethan and Liam's faces immediately lit up. "Really, Mommy? Can we invite our friends?" Liam asked, his eyes sparkling with excitement. Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll have music, games, and maybe even some ice cream. It'll be the best backyard party ever." As the boys eagerly started planning their guest list, Sarah's mind was already whirring with the logistics. She knew that the HOA would not take kindly to her defiance. but she was determined to give her children a day of joy, even if it meant risking the wrath of Vivian Harrington and her cronies. Later that afternoon, the Wilson family's backyard was transformed into a vibrant, lively scene. Neighbors from all around the community had gathered, their children splashing and laughing in the makeshift sprinkler system Sarah had rigged up. Music blared from a portable speaker, and the air was filled with the delighted squeals of the young partygoers. As Sarah watched her sons running and playing, her heart swelled with pride. She had managed to provide them with a much-needed respite from the oppressive heat, and for a moment, she felt a sense of triumph over the tyrannical HOA. But that feeling was short-lived. A sharp rap on the gate startled Sarah, and she turned to see the imposing figure of Vivian Harrington, her arms crossed over her chest and her expression thunderous. "Sarah Wilson," Vivian said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I see you've chosen to flagrantly disregard the rules of our community." Sarah's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "Vivian, the kids were miserable without the pool. I had to do something to keep them cool." Vivian's lips curled into a sneer. "That may be, but you are setting a dangerous precedent. The rules apply to everyone, regardless of personal circumstances." "But the heatwave," Sarah began, only to be silenced by a firm raise of Vivian's hand. "Enough excuses. You have 24 hours to dismantle this spectacle or face the full consequences of your actions." With that, Vivian turned on her heel and stalked away, leaving a stunned and terrified Sarah in her wake. The music and laughter slowly faded as the other neighbors realized the gravity of the situation, casting worried glances in Sarah's direction. As the sun began to set, Sarah gathered her sons, their faces fallen with disappointment. "I'm sorry, boys," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to take everything down. The HOA won't allow it." Ethan and Liam's eyes glistened with tears, and Sarah felt her heart break. She had tried to give them a moment of respite, but now they were facing the consequences of her defiance. The Oakwood Estates HOA had flexed its muscles once again, and the Wilsons were powerless to stop it. As the family began the arduous task of cleaning up the backyard, Sarah couldn't help but wonder how she would ever stand up to the formidable Vivian Harrington. The battle lines had been drawn, and the future was bleak. But deep down, she knew she had to find a way to fight back, for the sake of her children and the entire community. The following morning, Sarah Wilson awoke with a sense of determination coursing through her veins. She had spent a restless night mulling over her confrontation with Vivian Harrington and the ruthless Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, and she had reached a decision. She would not back down without a fight. As her sons Ethan and Liam ate their breakfast, Sarah explained her plan. "Guys, I know you were really disappointed about the party, but I have an idea. We're going to go to the next HOA meeting and stand up to Vivian and the others." Ethan's eyes widened, and Liam's brow furrowed in concern. "But Mommy, won't they be mad at us?" Liam asked, his voice quivering. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed their hands reassuringly. "I know it's scary, but we have to try. The HOA can't keep pushing us around. It's time we stand up for our rights." The boys exchanged a nervous glance, but eventually they nodded, their faces set with determination. They may have been young, but they understood the gravity of the situation and the importance of defending their family. Later that evening, the Wilson family made their way to the Oakwood Estates Community Center, where the HOA meeting was being held. As they entered the room, the chatter died down, and all eyes turned to them. Vivian Harrington, seated at the head of the table, fixed them with a disapproving stare. Well, if it isn't the Wilsons," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "To what do we owe this unexpected pleasure?" Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward, her chin held high. "Vivian, I'm here to speak on behalf of my family and the rest of the community. The rules you've been enforcing are unfair and unreasonable, especially during this heatwave." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Vivian's eyes narrowed. The rules are in place for a reason, Mrs. Wilson. We cannot make exceptions, no matter how inconvenient they may be. But Vivian, the kids were miserable without a way to cool off. Sarah pressed on, her voice firm. And your demands have been nothing short of tyrannical. We deserve to have a say in how our own community is run. Vivian's expression darkened, and she leaned forward, her fingers steepling in front of her. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Sarah. The Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association is the sole authority in this community, and we make the rules. Your personal grievances are of no concern to us. Sarah felt her heart racing, but she refused to back down. That's where you're wrong, Vivian. We're the ones who live here, who pay our dues, and we deserve to be heard. This isn't a dictatorship, it's a community, and we're not going to let you rule it with an iron fist. The room erupted in a chorus of cheers and applause, and Vivian's face twisted with fury. How dare you? She spat, slamming her fist on the table. This kind of insolence will not be tolerated. If you continue to defy the HOA, there will be consequences. Sarah stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. Then so be it. We're not going to back down, Vivian. Not this time. The tension in the room was palpable, and Ethan and Liam clung to their mother, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. But Sarah refused to be cowed. She had drawn a line in the sand, and she was prepared to fight for her family and her community, no matter the cost. As the meeting adjourned, Vivian stormed out, her entourage of HOA board members trailing behind her. The Wilsons stood firm, their resolve strengthened by the support of their neighbors. They had taken the first step in their battle against the tyrannical HOA, and they knew that the war was far from over. The tension in the Oakwood Estates community was palpable in the days following the HOA meeting showdown. Sarah Wilson's defiant stand against Vivian Harrington and the HOA board had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, and the ripples of discontent were beginning to spread. As Sarah and her sons, Ethan and Liam, went about their daily routines, they couldn't help but feel a heavy weight of scrutiny and suspicion from their neighbors. Whispers followed them as they walked down the pristine sidewalks, and they could sense the unease radiating from those around them. One afternoon, as Sarah was tending to her garden, a familiar black SUV pulled into the driveway. Her heart sank as Vivian Harrington stepped out, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Wilson, Vivian said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I was hoping we could have a little chat. Sarah wiped her brow, trying to conceal the nervousness that threatened to consume her. Of course, Vivian. What can I do for you? Vivian's lips curled into a tight-lipped smile. Well, I must say, your little display at the HOA meeting was quite impressive. You've managed to stir up quite a commotion in our otherwise peaceful community. Sarah's grip tightened on the garden tools in her hands. I was simply standing up for my family and our rights as homeowners, she said, her tone defiant. Vivian nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. I see. And tell me, Sarah, have you given any thought to the consequences of your actions? A chill ran down Sarah's spine, but she refused to back down. I'm not afraid of your threats, Vivian. This community belongs to all of us, not just the HOA. Vivian's expression hardened, and she took a step closer. Oh, my dear Sarah, you have no idea what you're up against. The Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association has its tentacles in every aspect of this community, and we do not take kindly to those who dare to challenge our authority. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she held her ground. Then I suppose we're at an impasse, Vivian, because I'm not going to stop fighting for what's right. Vivian let out a low chuckle, the sound sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. We shall see about that. With that, she turned and headed back to her car, the tires crunching against the gravel as she drove away. As the black SUV disappeared from view, Sarah felt a sense of dread wash over her. She knew that Vivian Harrington was not one to be trifled with, and the HOA's reach was far-reaching and powerful. But she also knew that she couldn't back down, not when the well-being of her family and her community were at stake. That evening, as Sarah and her sons sat around the dinner table, the conversation was somber and subdued. Ethan and Liam could sense the tension in the air, and they knew that their mother was facing something far more formidable than a simple HOA dispute. "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I won't let them win, sweetheart. I promise." Her eyes met Ethan's, and she saw the same determination reflected in his gaze. The Wilsons were in for a fight, one that would test the limits of their family's strength and resilience. But Sarah was more convinced than ever that she had to stand her ground, no matter the cost. The future of Oakwood Estates was at stake, and she would not let Vivian Harrington and the HOA trample all over her rights and the rights of her neighbors. The battle lines had been drawn, and the war was just beginning. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity in the Oakwood Estates community. Sarah Wilson's defiant stand against the Homeowners Association had not gone unnoticed, and her neighbors, emboldened by her courage, began to speak up and challenge the HOA's draconian rules. At first, the HOA board, led by the formidable Vivian Harrington, brushed off the growing discontent as mere complaints from a few disgruntled homeowners. But as the protests and demands for change continued to escalate, Vivian and her cronies realized that they were facing a full-blown rebellion on their hands. One afternoon, as Sarah tended to her garden, a knock on the gate startled her. Peering through the wrought iron bars, she was met with the familiar face of her neighbor, Emily, a young mother of two. "Sarah, have you heard?" Emily's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "The HOA is holding an emergency meeting tonight. I think they're finally going to address the community's concerns." Sarah felt a surge of hope, but also a twinge of apprehension. "Did they say what it's about?" Emily shook her head. "No, but the word on the street is that Vivian is furious. She's been trying to strong-arm the other board members into taking drastic measures." Sarah's heart sank. "Drastic measures? You don't think they'd try to?" "I don't know," Emily interrupted, her voice trembling. "But we have to be there, Sarah. We have to make our voices heard." With a resolute nod, Sarah agreed, and that evening, the community center was abuzz with tension and anticipation. Oakwood Estates residents of all ages had gathered, their faces etched with a mix of determination and trepidation. When Vivian Harrington finally took the stage, her expression was one of barely concealed rage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice tripping with condescension, "I'm sure you're all aware of the unrest that has been brewing in our community." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Vivian's eyes narrowed. "Well, I'm here to inform you that the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association will no longer tolerate this blatant disregard for our rules and regulations. Effective immediately, we are instituting a series of new measures to ensure the continued harmony and security of our beloved neighborhood." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, and she gripped Ethan's hand tightly. Liam, sensing the tension, pressed himself closer to his mother's side. "First and foremost," Vivian continued, "we will be increasing security patrols and implementing strict curfews for all residents. Any violations will be met with severe consequences." A collective gasp rose from the audience, and Sarah could feel the panic setting in. "Vivian, you can't do this," she shouted, unable to contain her outrage. Vivian's gaze locked onto Sarah, and her lips curled into a cruel smile. "Oh, but I can, Mrs. Wilson. As the president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, I have the authority to implement any measures I deem necessary to preserve the integrity of our community." The room erupted into a cacophony of protests and angry shouts, but Vivian raised her hand, silencing the crowd. Furthermore, any homeowners who refuse to comply with these new rules will face immediate fines and, if necessary, eviction. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Eviction? The thought of losing their home, their sanctuary, was too much to bear. She knew that Vivian Harrington was playing a dangerous game, one that threatened to tear the community apart. As the meeting adjourned, the Wilsons were left with a sense of dread and uncertainty. The HOA had made its move, and the battle for Oakwood Estates had just taken a dark and ominous turn. The Oakwood Estates community was in turmoil. The Homeowners Association's announcement of draconian new measures, including strict curfews and the threat of eviction, had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Residents were outraged, their once peaceful community now a powder keg of tension and fear. At the center of the storm stood Sarah Wilson, her family caught in the crosshairs of Vivian Harrington's ruthless campaign to maintain the HOA's absolute control. As the days passed, Sarah watched with growing trepidation as her neighbors, once friendly and welcoming, now eyed her with suspicion and hostility. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, a sharp knock on the door startled her. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she cautiously approached the entryway, her heart pounding. Peering through the peephole, she was greeted by the stern faces of two Oakwood Estates security guards, their uniforms crisp and their expressions unforgiving. "Mrs. Wilson," one of the guards said, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. "We're here to inform you that you've been issued a citation for violating the new curfew regulations." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "But it's only 7 o'clock. The curfew doesn't start until 9 p.m. The guard's jaw tightened. "That may be, ma'am, but the HOA has decided to enforce the curfew immediately. Failure to comply will result in further penalties." Sarah felt a surge of anger rising within her. This is outrageous. You can't just change the rules like that without warning. The guard's expression remained impassive. "I'm afraid I'm just following orders, ma'am. Now, I suggest you and your family get inside before the situation escalates." With that, the guards turned and marched back to their patrol car, leaving a fuming Sarah in their wake. She slammed the door, her hands trembling with rage. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with concern. Sarah pulled her sons into a tight hug, her heart aching. "Nothing, sweetie. Everything's going to be okay." But deep down, Sarah knew that nothing was okay. The Oakwood Estates HOA had tightened its grip, and they were willing to use any means necessary to crush the growing resistance within the community. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood only escalated. Neighbors who had once chatted amicably over the fence now eyed each other with suspicion, afraid to even step outside their homes for fear of incurring the wrath of the HOA's security forces. Sarah watched helplessly as Vivian Harrington's reign of terror continued unabated. Fines were levied, curfews were enforced, and the once vibrant community began to feel more like a prison than a place to call home. But Sarah refused to give in. She knew that the fight for Oakwood Estates was far from over, and she was determined to find a way to challenge Vivian's tyrannical rule. One evening, as she tucked Ethan and Liam into bed, she heard a soft knock at the door. Cautiously, she peered through the window, her breath catching in her throat when she saw the familiar face of her neighbor, Emily. "Sarah, we need to talk," Emily whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the deserted street. "I think I know a way we can fight back against the HOA." Sarah's heart raced with a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the tide was finally turning in Oakwood Estates. With Emily's help, maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to topple Vivian Harrington's iron-fisted rule and restore the community they loved. Sarah Wilson's heart raced as she ushered Emily into her home, her eyes darting around the dimly lit living room to ensure they weren't being watched. The Oakwood Estates community had become a veritable police state under the oppressive rule of the Homeowners Association, and any sign of resistance was met with swift and ruthless consequences. "What is it, Emily?" Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Have you found a way to fight back against Vivian and the HOA?" Emily's expression was a blend of determination and apprehension. "I think so, Sarah, but it's risky. We'd be going up against the entire HOA board, and I'm not sure how far they're willing to go to maintain their control. Sarah gripped Emily's arm, her eyes searching her neighbor's face. I don't care how risky it is. I can't stand by and watch them destroy our community any longer. The kids and we've already lost so much because of their tyranny. Emily nodded grimly. I know, Sarah. That's why I have to try. I've been doing some digging, and I think I've uncovered a way to expose the HOA's corruption and abuse of power. Sarah's eyes widened with anticipation. What have you found? Well, it all starts with the HOA's financial records, Emily began, her voice hushed. I've been looking into where our monthly dues are really going, and I think I found some discrepancies. Sarah felt a surge of hope rise within her. Discrepancies? You mean like misappropriation of funds? Emily nodded, her expression grim. Exactly. I've been tracking the money trail, and it looks like Vivian and the other board members have been siphoning off funds for their own personal use. Things like lavish vacations, expensive cars, and even shell companies that seem to be nothing more than fronts for their own financial gain. Sarah's stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. That's outrageous. How could they do this to us? I know, Sarah, Emily said, her voice laced with a steely determination. But I think we can use this information to our advantage. If we can expose their corruption and bring it to the attention of the community, maybe we can rally everyone to stand up and fight back. Sarah's mind raced with the implications of Emily's plan. But won't the HOA just try to bury the evidence? They have so much power in this community. Emily's lips curved into a grim smile. That's where you come in, Sarah. You've already shown that you're willing to stand up to them. If we can get the rest of the community on board, we might just have a chance of taking them down. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The prospect of finally holding the HOA accountable for their misdeeds was both exhilarating and terrifying. But as she thought of her children, her neighbors, and the once vibrant community they had all cherished, she knew that she couldn't back down. All right, Emily, she said, her voice steady and resolute. Let's do it. Let's take down the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association once and for all. The two women shook hands, their eyes gleaming with a shared determination. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. If they succeeded, they would not only free their community from the clutches of Vivian Harrington and her cronies, but also send a message that the residents of Oakwood Estates would no longer be cowed by the tyranny of the HOA. As Sarah watched Emily slip out into the night, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for their home was far from over, but this time they had the power of the truth on their side. And with that, she knew they just might have a chance. The stage was set for the showdown of the century in Oakwood Estates. Sarah Wilson and her neighbor Emily had uncovered a bombshell of evidence, exposing the rampant corruption and financial misdeeds of the Homeowners Association's leadership, led by the formidable Vivian Harrington. With their newfound knowledge, the two women set out to rally the rest of the community, determined to oust the corrupt HOA regime and restore their once idyllic neighborhood to its former glory. At the next HOA meeting, the air was thick with tension as Sarah and Emily stood before the board, their faces etched with a mixture of determination and righteous fury. Ladies and gentlemen of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, Sarah began, her voice clear and unwavering. We are here today to bring to light the shocking truth about the corruption and abuse of power that has been running rampant within this organization. Vivian Harrington's eyes narrowed, her expression a mask of cold disdain. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Wilson. The HOA has always acted in the best interests of our community. Emily stepped forward, her hands clutching a stack of documents. That's where you're wrong, Vivian. We have evidence that you and the other board members have been siphoning off our monthly dues for your own personal gain, funding lavish vacations, expensive cars, and even shell companies that are nothing more than fronts for your illicit activities. A collective gasp rippled through the room, and the other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Vivian, however, remained unfazed, her lips curling into a derisive sneer. Preposterous. These are nothing more than baseless accusations. I demand that you present this so-called evidence immediately, or face the consequences of your slander. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. The evidence is right here, Vivian, and we're not the only ones who have seen it. We've already shared this information with the community, and they're ready to take action. On cue, the doors to the community center burst open, and a crowd of Oakwood Estates residents flooded the room, their faces etched with a mixture of anger and determination. Down with the corrupt HOA, they chanted, their voices rising in a crescendo. Vivian's face contorted with rage, and she slammed her fist on the table. Security, remove these intruders immediately. But as the security guards moved to apprehend the protesters, the residents stood firm, their numbers overwhelming the outnumbered guards. In the chaos, Sarah and Emily seized the opportunity to approach the HOA board, their hands outstretched with the damning financial records. "This is your last chance, Vivian," Sarah said, her voice carrying over the din of the crowd. "Resign from the HOA, or we'll take this straight to the authorities." Vivian's eyes darted from the documents to the angry mob, her bravado finally crumbling. With a shaky hand, she signed her resignation, her once formidable grip on Oakwood Estates slipping through her fingers. As the crowd erupted in cheers, Sarah and Emily exchanged a triumphant glance. The tide had turned, and the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association was now in the hands of the community they had sought to control. In the days that followed, the residents of Oakwood Estates worked tirelessly to repair the damage done by Vivian Harrington and her corrupt cohorts. New leadership was elected, and a wave of positive changes swept through the neighborhood. The kiddie pool returned, the curfew was lifted, and a renewed sense of community and trust began to blossom. As Sarah watched her children splashing joyfully in the backyard pool, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and relief. They had won the battle, but the war for the soul of Oakwood Estates was far from over. Still, she knew that with the power of the community behind them, they could overcome any challenge that came their way. The future of Oakwood Estates was once again bright, and the Wilsons were ready to write the next chapter in their story.